Welcome to episode 3 of the 5th season of Decision Points. I'm David Makovsky, the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm happy to go on this journey with you. You're listening to this, it will be over 300 days since the start of the Israel-Hamas war. While most of the world has moved on from October the 7th and the fateful 9+ months since Hamas's brutal attack, yet, for many Israelis, they are reliving October 7th over and over again every single day. I've visited Israel many times since October the 7th and have spoken to many across all parts of society. And one thing is abundantly clear. Israelis are experiencing a deep and profound trauma, and most are not watching the same war that the rest of the world is watching. For many, the 115 hostages still held captive in Gaza is a daily reminder of what they have lost and what they have yet to gain. There was a definite moment after October the 7th where Israelis were united in grief, and they were united for the first time in a very long time. The divisions over the judicial overhaul that had fractured Israeli society were instantaneously a thing of the past. And it was time to come together and to fight the common enemy. However, this collective unity has sadly fractured over the 9+ months. Israelis are once again divided, and this time for different reasons. Many are divided over the hostage crisis and how and when to end the war. Many are desperate for the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, to enlist in military service and share the burden. Many in the ultra-Orthodox camp themselves, however, are resisting this call, and many are frustrated over the way the Israeli government has conducted the war in Gaza. Among all the cracks and cohesions in Israeli society, Israelis are largely unified on one key issue. Most Israelis want a hostage deal. Recent polls by the Israel Democracy Institute, featuring the excellent work of pollsters like Tamar Herman and Menachem Lazar, show that 56% of Israelis support a deal to release all the hostages and end the war in Gaza, while nearly 30% support a deal to release some hostages in exchange for a temporary ceasefire. The collective frustration with Prime Minister Netanyahu is palpable. Across recent polls, a plurality of Israelis think Netanyahu is putting his personal interest above the national interest and is standing in the way of a hostage deal. Polls aside, 300 days after October the 7th, what can we learn about Israeli society 9+ months into this war? There is virtually no one more equipped to better answer this question than my esteemed guest, colleague, and friend, Yossi Klein Halevi. I'm honored to have Yossi on today's podcast to discuss how October the 7th and the Gaza war have changed Israeli society and what lies ahead for the Israeli and Jewish people. Yossi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem and co-director of the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, which teaches young Muslim American leaders about Judaism in Israel. Yossi is an award-winning journalist and is a best-selling author of several books. His most recent book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is a New York Times bestseller. Yossi also co-hosts with Daniel Hartman a podcast called For Heaven's Sake, where he discusses political and social trends in Israel, diaspora relations, and the collective consciousness of being Jewish. Yossi, welcome to Decision Points.
Well, David, the admiration is mutual, and you're one of the righteous ones. I'm just really glad to be with you.
I feel this way about you, as you know. I look to you as someone who can make sense of the bigger picture and the society, and how really has October 7th changed Israeli society. We have guests here always talking about the politics and the governments and different policy issues, but I see this episode as understanding how has October 7th really changed Israel. I mean, as someone who watches Israeli TV in Hebrew live each day, sometimes you feel Israel's frozen on October the 7th. You watch a newscast and halfway into it or 2/3 way into it, they still have features about this aspect of October 7th and that aspect of October 7th. After this podcast airs, it'll be over 300 days since October the 7th. Take us through this broad sweep of how would you assess where Israeli society is at this time in terms of the impact of October 7th?
Well, you're absolutely right that it's still October 7th for everyone here on a certain level. Today, I was watching a clip of the father of a soldier who was killed on the 7th being interviewed, as if it just happened. And it was this extraordinary experience of watching this father, first of all, speaking with this kind of slight smile on his face, which I found a little unnerving at first. And then I realized that little smile is a frozen face. He spoke so calmly about his extraordinary son who held off a group of terrorists. He didn't have a weapon, and he held them off for a half hour and allowed the reinforcements to come. He himself was killed. And you realize we're all still learning new details. There was a story in the Times of Israel the other day how one of the hostages who was being operated on in Gaza just spoke out now about what actually happened to her. And she said doctors poured chlorine into her open wound. She was being tortured by doctors. You hear these stories and you realize we don't know anything yet. We know the broad outlines. We really don't know the texture of what happened. Just on that simple level alone, there's this feeling that there's a world contained within that one day that we're going to be unpacking for years to come. Since October 7th, I have had a very wobbly relationship with time. I'm never quite sure what day it is. Sometimes I literally forget what month it is. The other day, is it April? No, it's August. I couldn't remember. And I think this is happening in one way or another to everybody here. We are unmoored. We are so disoriented. And October 7th has disrupted the most basic ways that we think about this country. I mean, look, many of us had no expectations to lose regarding this government. I can't say that October 7th shattered my faith in our government because it wasn't there to begin with. It certainly shattered our faith in the army, and needless to say, the intelligence branch of the army. So I don't know what to think. I do feel, and this was clear immediately after the 7th, that two essential elements of the Israeli story have been shattered, the story that we've told ourselves. The first is that we have a credible military deterrence. That's gone. The moment the Houthis are shelling Tel Aviv, you've lost your deterrence in the region. And the second, in some ways even deeper shattering, was the loss of the promise that Zionism made to the Jewish people of creating a safe refuge. David, you and I are old enough to remember when this country sent 100 commandos halfway across Africa to save Israeli citizens who'd been hijacked. And on October 7th, we couldn't save 1,200 Israelis within the sovereign borders of the state. This is the anti-Entebbe, and how ironic that it's the two Netanyahu brothers who are kind of the bookends of the high and the low of the Israeli ethos. These are the multiple layers of shattering that really are going to take us a generation or more to process.
Is Israel reverting back to a normal on a certain level, or is there just a new normal as you see it? I'm trying to look at also for certain tell signs of this you wouldn't have seen before October the 7th. This is the new Israel. Or where's Israel recovered its footing and gone back to itself? If you had to say, where's the continuity, where's the discontinuity?
I don't see any continuity at all. And I know that's a big statement, but I'm hard-pressed to think of life today in any sense being a continuity with what came before. I'll give you an example. I was out on the streets every week for the year leading up to October 7th, part of the democracy movement trying to save the Israeli ethos and democratic institutions. After October 7th, I stopped going to demonstrations, partly because I felt, not that I thought there was anything wrong with demonstrating during the war. I don't think there is. But I know that many, many Israelis do. And I was afraid that we'd be alienating potential supporters by continuing the demonstrations. And I think that, in fact, has happened. So I stayed away from the demonstrations. There are a few things that are worth noting about the demonstrations that have continued. The first is that there are two protest movements that are increasingly converging, but there are two distinct movements. One is led by the hostage families, and that is to prioritize the hostages over defeating Hamas. And the second is the movement, which is a continuity of the democracy protests, and that's elections now. And again, there is an increasing convergence between these two movements, but they haven't totally merged. So the other week I went to one of these demonstrations that were demanding both elections now and prioritizing the hostages. And I just kept asking myself, what am I doing here? This is a pale reflection of what we had before October 7th. We're not going to bring the government down this way. And I came home so demoralized, and I haven't been back to a demonstration since. Now, I understand and respect the people who are still going out there week after week, but I felt, as someone who remains totally committed to that agenda, I don't know what to do right now. And the latest polls were so demoralizing that I was literally depressed for 2 days. I felt almost clinically depressed. The polls that showed that Netanyahu is now the leading candidate for prime minister because of his speech in Washington. And it made me so depressed to think about my fellow Israelis. Really? A speech? Another Netanyahu speech? And now he's the guy who you think can best lead this country. Anyway, what I'm really just trying to convey to you is not a political position, but an inner emotional state. The conversation that I have with friends is really, how do you keep from fighting despair? Now, that's so un-Israeli. Israelis never talked about despair, and I hear that all the time. I'm sure you'll find continuity. The restaurants are open in Tel Aviv, and there was the Jerusalem Film Festival the other day, but none of it feels normal. It all feels in a way like we're going through the motions. We are in some ways in a lull between phases of the war. We all know that war with Hezbollah can erupt literally at any moment, especially now after the 12 kids were killed in Majd al-Shams. There's this sense of wild uncertainty. Now, Israeli reality was always uncertain. We always lived in the moment. This is something else. This is a profound uncertainty about whether the basic structures are holding, whether the society is holding.
Well, you mentioned the social cohesion and the sense of solidarity. That was always the hallmark of Israel. This was the Israeli ethos of self-reliance, and you could say this was because of Israel was born with enemies all around, 5 armies attacking Israel the day it was born. This sense of national cohesiveness, of solidarity, has been really the signature trademark of Israel, I think, in many ways. And that was really tested and ripped even, not just frayed during the judicial controversy. Then October 7th comes along, and you hear all these stories about reserve units where the people were coming in at 150% the level they needed. And it seemed like the old Israel was back. Where is that cohesiveness now? On one hand, October 7th is the dominant defining point of Israel. On the other hand, I did see a poll that at Channel 13, 2 days or 3 days after the speech, that Netanyahu was gaining, but still doesn't have a coalition, but he's moving up. The sense of cohesiveness, I just want to know, how strong is it? The hostages seemed like the number one metric to look at. You do see all these people coming out for the hostages. There's something of identification within the society of every soldier, every hostage. And yet, you say, well, yeah, David, but it's being tested there. It's being tested by the Haredi draft issue, which maybe we could touch on. The ultra-Orthodox, are they going to be drafted or not? And all the different permutations. And I'm just trying to think about the fabric of Israel. How 300 days plus on, how strong is that fabric?
Let's linger for a moment on the immediate post-October 7th Israel, because something extraordinary, and I would say unprecedented, happened on October 8th. And that is that not only did we come together in one of the peak expressions of national solidarity, but we did so coming immediately from the lowest point of national schism in our history. We instantly pivoted from October 6th to October 8th in a way that if you had asked me on October 6th whether that would ever be possible again, I'm not sure I would have believed it. And I think that that's true for many Israelis. We shocked ourselves by our capacity to re-inhabit the instincts of peoplehood. We were once again an extraordinarily functioning people. You mentioned the reservist turnout. Something like 50% of Israelis engaged in some act of voluntarism immediately after October 7th.
Including
50%.
Israeli Arabs.
Very much so, especially the Bedouin, who've really been Israelized again as a result. They were losing their connection to Israeli society, many of them. October 7th has really given us another opportunity to reestablish that connection. The immediate post-October 7th reality was extraordinary.
There's not always a reckoning on the Arab side. Nasrallah and Sinwar and all these people who thought Israel is so weak, their pilots are not flying and they're not participating in reserve duty. They saw this resilience. That Israel snapped back together in a way that, of course, I hope is not misinterpreted by sound bites. They unified Israel. They totally miscalculated.
But David, they always miscalculate. They always think that we're on the run, and they don't understand that we're really an indigenous people, and we react the way an indigenous people under threat reacts. And they believe their own lies, their own version of our story, and it keeps undermining them. There's one more thing, really, that's worth noting about the immediate post-October 7th reality. For me, it was the moment of maturation for Israeli society, because this is the first time that we went to war with a solid majority of Israelis having no faith whatsoever in the most basic credibility and decency of our political leaders. A poll was asked of Israelis shortly after October 7th, do you believe Netanyahu places the national interest ahead of his own or his own interest? Over 60% said he places his own interest first. Israelis, as you well know, as a student of Israeli history, David, you know that we always doubt the wisdom of our leaders in war. It was true of Levi Eshkol in the weeks leading up to the Six-Day War. It was certainly true of Golda Meir, who had to resign after the Yom Kippur War. Menachem Begin was essentially hounded from office because of the failures of the First Lebanon War. But no Israeli would have ever doubted that Golda and Begin and Eshkol, all of them, placed the national interest ahead of their own political well-being, especially during war. And yet, we all went to war anyway. Now, I don't know anyone who was waiting on October 7th. What is Netanyahu saying? What are we going to do? Everyone mobilized themselves. This was our war. And that's why, when I speak to outsiders and they say, Netanyahu's war, and my response is, say whatever you want about this war. But it's not Netanyahu's war. It's my war. This is our war. It's the war of the people of Israel. Condemn it. Call us war criminals. This actually has nothing to do with Netanyahu.
I think with all the other leaders, it was a question of questioning their policies. This is the one case where people are questioning motivation. Huge distinction. And that explains the schism between him and the defense establishment. It's a very different situation than we've ever seen. How strong is this resilience? If, God forbid, the hostages don't come back, or the Haredi are not drafted. What threatens this sense of social cohesion? How strong is the fabric?
We have two tremendous strains. The first is what we've been talking about, which is Netanyahu and his government, and the incitement against his political opponents didn't stop for a moment. He's always careful not to do it directly. He allows others to do it. He has his media, Channel 14 TV, radio stations, where his people have been spreading the conspiracy theories in the immediate aftermath of October 7th that there were high-ranking officers in the army who knew Hamas was going to attack and allowed it to happen because they were hoping it would bring Netanyahu down. I speak to Netanyahu supporters. That's almost a normative belief in that camp today. And so there's so much poison that's been spreading. Or, for example, blaming October 7th on the democracy demonstrations and the pilots who announced that they would no longer be volunteering for service. One can certainly argue whether the refusal to serve in reserves contributed to the perception of our weakness that allowed October 7th to happen. I think that's a fair discussion. But what Netanyahu and his supporters are trying to do is to deflect all of the criticism away from himself and onto the opposition. Everyone is guilty for October 7th, except the guy who's been prime minister for almost 2 decades. Everyone else. Rabin is guilty because of Oslo. I just heard this the other
Sharon
day.
because
Ehud Barak
of
is
Gaza.
guilty. Yes. Now, okay, you want to argue about the wisdom of any of those moves? Fair enough. But Netanyahu has been prime minister for 17 years. Nothing, no change. Anyway, that all falls under the category of don't get me started. But the other force that's undermining our cohesiveness is exactly what should have united us, and that's the fate of the hostages. When you walk the streets in Israel, you'll see 2 kinds of posters with faces of Israelis. There's one set of posters of kidnapped Israelis in Gaza. And then there's another set of posters of fallen Israeli soldiers. And underneath it, it says, Ad lanitzachon, until victory. Now, what's going on there? We have never seen anything like this in Israeli history, where fallen soldiers and their faces are being plastered around the country to counteract as a kind of emotional counterweight whatever sympathy you have for the hostages. And what's the real argument there is what should we prioritize? Should we prioritize saving the hostages or defeating Hamas? Here are the pictures of soldiers who died trying to defeat Hamas. And are you going to allow their deaths to have been in vain? In other words, don't be tempted to sympathize too much with the hostages. Remember that there's a war going on. We need to win. I look at both of these sets of posters, and I agree with both. Say, of course, we have to do everything we can to save the hostages. That is the most basic element of Israeliness. It's a foundational principle of Jewish peoplehood. On the other hand, if this war ends with Hamas in power, we've lost. And whatever shreds of deterrence we've been able to salvage because of our response to October 7th will be definitively lost. So I understand the arguments of both. But what is this emotional manipulation? How dare you use the photographs of fallen soldiers to emotionally compete with the photographs of hostages? This isn't the society that I knew. And I listen to how the right, and especially the far right, talk with almost contempt about the hostages, and especially the hostage families. Now, hostage families have been attacked on the streets in Israel. They've been attacked by far-right activists physically, demonstrating to prioritize the hostages. Where are we? What is this Israel? What has Netanyahu released? What kind of profound pathologies are we dealing with now? And how do we recover as a society from that? The damage that Netanyahu has done to Israel is going to take us many years to recover.
Do you think the hard right would have reacted differently if the people being held hostage were not secular people, went to a music festival on a Friday night near the Gaza border, but instead were settlers, for example, or were Haredim or
That's
ultra-Orthodox?
interesting.
Or another interpretation might be they're afraid that some of the Palestinian prisoners will be released in the West Bank, where many of them live. Or a third version is they are convinced that the hostages are the only thing that stand between them and getting rid of Hamas. Explain this for an American audience, and we have listeners, of course, not just in the United States, but around the world. But for a non-Israeli audience, explain why this reaction is the way it is.
I will give the far right the benefit of the doubt in one sense. They tend to be pretty consistent and they tend to mean what they say. One doesn't have to do a great deal of interpretation. Unlike Netanyahu, whose moves need to constantly be scrutinized, one needs to get to the bottom of how he perceives his political interests at any given time. That's not the case with Ben Gvir and Smotrich and the other politicians in the far right. These are very sincere people. And that's good news and bad news. I wish that they were corruptible, but they're not. They are the real thing. And it's precisely because I come from that world, as you alluded to. I was a teenager in the Jewish Defense League. I was a follower of Meir Kahane, and I know the far-right mindset because I experienced it. I give them the benefit of their problematic idealism. That does not apply to Netanyahu. I think Netanyahu is playing politics with the lives of the hostages. For Netanyahu, the question isn't what takes priority, the lives of the hostages or the strategic goal of defeating Hamas. What takes priority is his political interests. And there was this devastating interview the other day on the news here with one of the hostages who was released. I think her name is Miriam Moshe. And she was talking about her last conversation with, I believe it was Itzik Danzig, who was one of the hostages who recently was declared dead, who was captured alive and died in captivity. She said to him, you have to keep up your hope. And he said, how can I have hope? And she said, what do you mean? What do you mean, how can you have hope? There's the state of Israel. We have the state behind us. And she said, we have a prime minister named Netanyahu, and we are leftists. We, the hostages, are leftists. And I'm haunted by the fact that our hostages are tormented by the realistic assessment that Netanyahu doesn't really care about them. And that's also unprecedented. We have never had anything like this in Israeli history. An Israeli leader who doesn't care about the lives of hostages. That's the end of the state of Israel. It's the end of the Jewish state, as we understood it.
But it is striking with all these hostages who were released when they tell these stories as well. When they'll say, so the captors let us watch Al Jazeera or watch Israeli TV or radio, and we'll hear there was a demonstration for the hostages and how that boosted our spirits, that we knew we were not suffering in silence, that there was a whole people behind us, and that kept us going. But to know that as you're in captivity, you have this technology that gives you access to what's going on in the country you were taken captive from, and that there are all these people behind you, and that somehow was a source of profound strength.
Although I think one should note that the stories that we're hearing, and again, they're coming out in trickles from released hostages, their experiences were very uneven. That's
Sure.
a reflection of the fact that they were parceled out among families, which is extraordinary. Families are holding hostages. There's one story that just came out about the Al Jazeera journalist who was killed when his hostages were freed by the army. He was a sadist who loved to torture his hostages. One of the hostages said that he would tie him up sometimes for a week at a time with his hands behind his back in a very painful, contorted way. I think that just needs to be added as a qualifier. But you're right that there's something surreal about this war in many ways. And one of the ways is that, that some of the hostages were able to keep track of how Israel was responding in real time.
This relationship between the Israeli society and the military, Israel what used to be like Sparta, a garrison democracy. People thought of themselves as part of a wider collective. Now, how long can you be on perpetual mobilized footing? I mean, ultimately, forces of westernization, of individualism, of affluence have shaped Israeli society. So it seems like, Israel has gone from a Sparta to an Athens. But people say, well, the army's going to have to be bigger. The army is going to have to play a bigger role in people's lives because you're going to need greater forces along the border and elsewhere. How do you go from Sparta to Athens and back? When all these greater societal forces, winds, that are bigger than Israel. Any high-tech guy could get on an airplane with a one-way ticket to the Silicon Valley. What is the mix between Sparta and Athens going forward, and how does it link to the role of the military in Israeli society and the trust levels needed for the future?
So look, first of all, in terms of the trust level, when Israelis think about the army, we think about ourselves. We think about our kids and their commanders and our neighbors, and it's very intimate. The army is us. There's nothing abstract about the army in Israel. The trust level is that we all know the army. We know how the army works. We know that sometimes it's amazing, and we know how lazy and dysfunctional any big institution can be, including the army. It doesn't diminish the love and sense of protectiveness that we feel. When the IDF is called a criminal army, we respond so viscerally. You're calling me a Nazi. You're calling me a war criminal. There is no us and them when it comes to the army. This is the only army we have. And when I look at how the army has performed in the last 9 months in Gaza, I have questions. Lots of Israelis have questions. Have we been imaginative enough? Have we been daring enough? On the other hand, I have such tremendous admiration for the soldiers and the officers, the frontline officers. Many of them have been fighting for months in impossible circumstances. The trust level is a given. It would be very hard to see that trust undermined, given the fact that the army is a cross-section of Israeli society, more or less a cross-section. You mentioned the ultra-Orthodox. Of course, most Arab Israelis don't serve. And I think that that's obviously going to change. The army has been put on notice by the Supreme Court that the old arrangement is over. And we're going to go through tremendous social upheavals as the full extent of the Supreme Court's decision really begins to take hold. We're going to see, I suspect, serious draft resistance, open refusal, and we'll see how we handle that. But this is a showdown that has to happen. And one of the changes that October 7th has brought is that it will end the absurd relationship between the ultra-Orthodox and the rest of Israeli society, which is based on several layers of absurdity. The first is total or near total separatism from the obligations of citizenship for a state under constant threat. The second is that because of our corrupt political system, we, the mainstream, subsidize separatism. And then the third layer is that the ultra-Orthodox then turn around to the rest of us who are subsidizing their separatism, and they say to us, we don't like the way you live your Jewish lives, and here's a set of laws that we're going to impose on you. And then it gets even more absurd when the ultra-Orthodox community then proceeds to demonstrate open contempt for the cherished symbols of the state. Show me another country on the planet, in the galaxy, where something like this would be tolerated. Israelis are saints, really, but even saints have their limits, and October 7th was our limit.
When you're in the 1940s and you're Eastern European immigrants coming out of the Holocaust or traditionalist Jews coming out of the Middle East, It's one sort of country, but now in the 21st century, with all of its influence of westernization, of individualism and affluence, it's not the same country. And yet that country is faced with real enemies, and that's going to require a different kind of balance. How do you find the balance?
I'm greatly reassured about our capacity to balance Athens and Sparta, to use your metaphors, as a result of October 8th, how we reconstituted ourselves as a coherent society, and the sacrifices Israelis have made. We've proven that not only can we cohere as a people, as a society, but we're also capable of making enormous sacrifices. But I have one caveat here. And that is that Israelis, and here I'll speak about liberal Israelis, that part of Israel that is largely responsible for the Israeli success story, startup nation, academia, Israel's reputation around the world, our health system, that part of Israel, I think, is ready and able to sacrifice, provided that they believe that this is still a decent country. And that's why changing the government is an existential imperative. It's a question of keeping this country together and holding our best people so that they don't end up in Canada or Australia. And that's a big worry for me. It's a huge worry.
The whole issue of also Israel's relations with America and American Jews and American society. I mean, as I say, interests bind governments, but values bind societies. The brilliance of Israel for decades, being a bipartisan cause, was it understood the need to be both about interests and values. There's a phrase sometimes in Hebrew, hakol interesim, everything is interest. And I say, no, it isn't. It's about values. And if people have a sense of common values, those relationships will remain strong. And if I think of the great presidents who's, had formative moments of Israel, whether it's Harry Truman, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Joe Biden, what drove them to Israel was the sense of common values. The interests came later in many ways. I mean, there was no Silicon Valley in 1948. There was no startup nation then. It was about values. I worry that people tend to say, we'll provide more intelligence for America because America's going to get sick of the Middle East. And therefore, by being America's regional cop of some sort, we will maintain that U.S.-Israel relationship. And I don't see it that way. I see it the way you see it, but you see it also internally, the values of the country from within. And that I of course agree with that. It's also how that is projected outward.
Right. For me, what will decide Israel's future will be from within outward. That's what we were fighting for in the democracy movement, along with the need to reach out to other sectors of Israeli society and reestablish some commonality. Now, of course, within the army, in reserve units, this has been happening since October 8th, and in very powerful ways. So I'm wondering whether the new message of hope won't come from the reservists returning home.
You do hear people saying, look, what's happened is that everyone lives in their bubble. You could live in North Tel Aviv. You'll hear only people in that echo chamber that actually your view. You could be living in, in a Beit El settlement and have that perspective that's ideological, or Har Nof and Haredi perspective. But what reservists do, and again, the Haredi issue is more complicated because they largely don't serve. What it's done is it throws Israelis to live in one common place together where they're fighting for each other's lives. They literally depend on the other one for their own lives. It's existential for them. Maybe that's a source of hope to see that here's this laboratory where they have to work together or they don't live. And that will break down some of the stereotypes the one has of the other.
I think that that's been happening. And there's a very interesting new movement called the last quarter or the final quarter, Harivon Acharon, which is an attempt to bring Israelis together from very different parts of society. And they have something like 150,000 members. I was just at a parlor meeting the other night. They're doing this all over the country every night. Something is happening, and they're openly talking about becoming a political movement. We're going to see lots of ferment, and it's already begun. I don't have a problem generally dealing with people of different ideological opinions. Maybe it's because, you and I have a background in journalism and we spend so much of our time listening to rival opinions and processing them. And I respect, to some extent, most of the camps here, the political and cultural ideologies. What I have trouble with, and I cannot reconcile to this, is the decency divide that this government has opened up. And that's something that I can't forgive them for. They've injected the question that we've never had to deal with before in Israel, which is, can I trust the basic decency of my opponents?
That's a pretty harsh indictment. And I'm not saying here what's justified or not. Obviously, that gets back to what I was saying before about motivation, is that you could debate policies, but you can't debate if you're convinced the other one doesn't come from a place that he loves the country just as much as you do and its citizens. That's a real problem. You're a unique figure in that you live in Israel, your life is Israel, but professionally, you go to campuses in America. You're from the United States. You write often for an American audience, and you were just in the US. And that's another thing you and I share. I think I visited over 190 campus visits about Israel. It's a lot. So I just wanted your impressions about how you, on the societal level, where do you see the convergences, the divergences after October 7th with America, American Jews, American campus life? What's your diagnosis? Sometimes the people who are not living in it have a very interesting perspective versus those of us who are very much in the middle of it all.
So I think that what the progressive anti-Zionists have done to American Jews is reintroduce the conditionality of American acceptance of its Jews. By that I mean that when I was growing up, I'm a little bit older than you, but you might remember this as well. The American Jewish community of my youth, I'm speaking about the 1960s and 70s, was a very insecure community. It was always looking over its shoulder. It didn't feel physically unsafe. America always made place for the Jews. But there was this sense that Jewish acceptance into the American mainstream was conditional. Don't act too Jewish, tone down the Jew, maybe change your family name. That's always a good idea. Don't speak with your hands. Don't be too overtly, problematically Jewish. And that began to change. I saw it already when I was in school in the late 1970s. I went to Northwestern. I studied journalism there. And Northwestern, until the late 60s, I think, had a quota for Jews. That was gone by the time I got to campus. It was a very important experience for me because I was coming from deep, deep, deep in the heart of Jewish Brooklyn. And Northwestern was
Holocaust survivors, right? All your families.
Yeah, absolutely. And my whole neighborhood. I grew up in Borough Park, a neighborhood of survivors.
Someone even told me, who lived in Borough Park with a common friend of ours, said, I didn't know anyone who had a Jewish grandparent growing up in Borough Park.
My mother's parents came to America just before the war. So I had one set of grandparents. And all my friends loved coming to my house because it felt normal. Because, my mother was quasi-American. And all my friends knew my grandparents. That they were the grandparents. The only grandparents in my whole extended group of friends. The sense of conditionality of Jewish acceptance really began to fade through the 80s and the 90s. Suddenly, Jews were accepted. It didn't matter. You could be a Chabadnik and you could be lighting a Chanukiah in the White House. And what the progressives have done, the crime that progressive anti-Zionists have committed against American Jewry is restoring conditionality to acceptance. We will accept you. God forbid, we're not anti-Semites. You can even have a Seder at our tent camp, but you have to fix that one problematic part of your identity. As soon as you insert the idea that there's something about Jewishness that's a problem, you are communicating the message to young Jews that there's something wrong with you. The result will be deep insecurity. And that's what I see happening on campuses. American Jews are feeling insecure again about their place. And this isn't a question of physical safety. It's deeper and it's worse. It's a question of psychological safety. And that's what worries me.
Someone would have said to you several years ago that there would be this race between those who want to normalize with Israel and those who want to criminalize Israel. And the people who want to normalize with Israel are Arabs from the Persian Gulf. And the people who want to criminalize are sometimes in this country, in the United States. I don't think either of us would have believed it. I mean, how the world has gone upside down.
It's fantastic. And by fantastic, I mean literally fantastic. It's literally unbelievable. I was thinking recently about the oil-producing states that are leading the charge for normalization. 50 years ago, after the Yom Kippur War, the oil states were leading the criminalization of Israel. The Zionism-Racism resolution in the UN was an initiative, together with the Soviet Union, of the oil countries. And so here we are, half a century later, everything has turned upside down. And I was in Morocco last year, and I told people there, I feel far more comfortable as an Israeli, and for that matter as a Jew, walking around wearing a kippah all over Morocco than I do in New York today, never mind London or Paris. You're right, the world is turning upside down. David, if I had to choose between being accepted in the Middle East and being accepted on college campuses, speaking as an Israeli, just from my own perspective, there's no question I far prefer being accepted by the Middle East. It's crazy that we can only have one of those options. But it also, reality is so fluid. And this really proves it, that if we can move in half a century from seeing the oil-producing countries as our greatest enemy to today, maybe our greatest friends.
For all our concerns about American campuses is the importance of not giving up. There is a debate there, and knowing you for decades, I know you're someone who will never give up, as I will never give up. This debate will continue, and all I could say is thank you so much for sharing your insight and wisdom with us today, and may you continue to go from strength to strength, and thank you very much for joining Decision Points.
And David, just wonderful to be with you, and thanks for everything you do. Thanks for the chance to reconnect.
Israeli society underwent a massive shock on October the 7th, which upended deeply held convictions about the army and the state. The horrors of the Hamas assault and the immediate needs of the war brought Israelis together, bound by stories of heroism, shared duties of service, and widespread engagement with civil society. That short-term reaction speaks to the vibrancy and durability of Israeli society, especially in a crisis. But trauma's effects are often in the medium and long term, and without direction, Israeli society could easily return to the fraying process of the past several years, with cracks already sadly evident. Despite a widespread desire for change and an agreement on a broad swath of issues, popular sentiment alone cannot carry Israel through the challenging transition, from shock and trauma to healing and rebuilding a stronger and more integrated society. There are formal mechanisms, investigations, elections, legal accountability, which have to take place to allow Israeli institutions to update itself to the new demands and desires of Israeli society. Whether they can meet this moment will be decided by political and thought leaders who bear much responsibility for existing societal divisions and now face an opportunity to strengthen the country. And of course, the war will have to end, and Israel's security situation must stabilize. Then an actual accounting of what was lost on October 7th will commence in earnest. As painful as that reckoning may be, it is likely to strengthen the country for the long and challenging road ahead. Thank you for joining us on Decision Points. Thank you to my dedicated team of research assistants at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I want to thank Sidney Helbush and Gabriel Epstein, as well as intern David Etterberg. I also want to thank Rob, Hadia, and the production team at Podville Media, and listeners like you for making this podcast possible. please leave us a 5-star review so we can grow this community. You can find Decision Points on Apple Music, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Download and subscribe to never miss an episode. To our listeners from all over the world, I hope you listen to all of Season 5 of Decision Points.